Okay. Okay, I'm gonna start by asking you if somebody feels okay with sitting a bit closer to us here up front. It would be quite amazing if we could maybe, there's like 2-3 rows here in the front where maybe we could try to be a bit more intimate as this hall is not 100% full. Wow. Amazing, thank you. So nice to have some faces close up. Okay, really happy to be here today and glad that so many showed up. My name is Hanna Densik Petersson. I'm the director of the Oslo Architecture Triennale, who is behind this event here today and the project that it's based on, together with Efflux Architecture. I'll start saying a few words, and then I'll give the mic over to Cecilia Sachs-Olsen, who is curator of, was one of the chief curators of the Triennale in 2019, and after her again, Nicholas Hirsch, who's editor of Efflux Architecture. So just, welcome everyone. And so to this third and last event and conversation based on an essay series with the title of Overgrowth that we have worked on with Efflux Architecture for the last 2 years. We have published essays throughout 2018 and in 2019. So this is kind of a final event, somehow summing up the collaboration and the project. And the project started from the Triennale side, thinking about how we could kind of give back to an international audience that were never able to travel to Oslo. Because a lot of our projects and a lot of our initiatives are, they're of course going to be in collaboration with international participants and contributors, but they're all happening here. They're either exhibited in an exhibition or the event takes place in Oslo. So how do we contribute to conversations amongst people that are never here and that we never meet? And Efflux Architecture is that type of platform where we can do that. So we are very happy that we were able to collaborate on producing content online as a part of the Triennale, even though it doesn't happen here or you can't touch it. But still an important part of the program of the Triennale, and the collaboration but also a part of the call when we looked for chief curators for 2019. And I think we managed in that. We managed to reach an international audience, maybe more, of course more so than here at home. So the way we try to make it visible here is through these 3 events, where we have been inviting writers of the essays to come together in physical space as well, not just online, to share their thoughts. And as I'm not going to speak too long, I'll just say a few words about the series, and that it's supported by the Nordic Culture Fund and the Nordic Culture Point, which has helped us make sure that 50% of the essays are by Nordic writers. So today it's great to kind of have 2 of the essays which are kind of also basing their content on 2 Nordic cities, so Oslo and Stockholm, together with Anna Mills' fictional essay. So the title of the essay series is Overgrowth, and I guess overconsumption is something that we're really kind of specialists here in Norway and the kind of Northern Europe, that we're kind of winning that competition of overconsumption. And I think it's one of the most important issues that we need to tackle today, and I think also especially within our professions, because architects and planners are really in the midst of that overconsumption. And I think this essay series shows how important on all kind of across disciplines and across themes that this is important. Okay, so the Triennale is closed. 2019 is over, it's 2020. We're kind of leaving some things behind, but I think the theme of the Triennale is something that we need to stick with. It's not something we can kind of put in a cupboard and say, okay, so we did a Triennale on climate and kind of an environmental emergency, and now we move on. But I think, yeah, we just have to keep, there's really nothing else we can do than keeping that in mind. And we will, before I hand over to Cecilia, I just want to say also this year, 2020, is an important year for the Triennale. It's an anniversary, actually. It's 20 years ago we had the first Triennale here in Oslo. So this year we'll have an anniversary project or an anniversary event in the autumn of the in Oslo of 2020, and we'll try to, of course, bring these questions that we've been discussing in 2019 forward. So thank you, Nikolaus, for the collaboration with Efflux Architecture. Thank you to all the writers, but Anna, Helene, and Ingrid, who's here today. Thank you to Aho, who's hosting the event, and Alexandra for organizing everything. Now, Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to contribute with a little introduction to the theme of the Triennale, and for those of you who don't know it for some reason. But it's also a kind of a provocation. I want to say that we have to stop talking about the climate. The climate crisis is now the precondition of any story that we tell today. Often these stories are apocalyptic. They tell about an end-of-the-world emergency in which we, the people, are universal victims suffering from common threat or common challenges that are the result of abstract processes beyond our control. And of course, there is a risk with these stories that they oversimplify and generalize the issues at hand. Universal concepts such as the people ignores issues of, for example, social difference. So indigenous culture, for example, have lived through exactly the same kind of socio-environmental breakdown, which is now predicted by climate scientists several times over. And also, by failing to identify specific enemies, the question of allies can hardly arise. And all kinds of powerful interests are provided with a mandate for taking back the planet by implementing control, exercising power, because in taking back control, there's hope, we're told. If only we find the right technologies, we will be fine. Then we can assure that we do not have to change our ways of living as part of the capitalist system, and also that we continue business as usual. So the objective here is to provide a sense of immediate solutions that serves to maintain existing systems and practices rather than transforming them. And yet it is so clear that these existing systems are exactly the reason why we are in the mess that we are in right now. So I would argue that if we want to take the climate seriously, we need to stop talking about the climate. Instead, let's talk about the mechanisms and processes that made this mess to begin with. Let's talk about economic growth. Let's talk about how environmental questions are closely linked to the power structures of capitalism, of patriarchy, of colonialism. Let's talk about how environmental damage might be a question of culture, which, with implications for how we treat each other and the planet that is much more embedded and deep-rooted than technocratic questions that only address how to reduce carbon emissions. Let's talk about degrowth and the possibility of a different way of organizing society altogether. Let's talk about sufficiency, about living with enough for having a good life and not more for the sake of more. With the 2019 Oslo Architecture Triennale, we initiated this discussion on degrowth. And it was not easy. No. Instead of this kind of dominant story about sustainability that focuses on an external call for limits, so that is that we have to limit ourselves because the nature is running out of resources, degrowth is about a social call for limits. We have to limit ourselves because we want to collectively take responsibility for each other and the planet that we are living on. So degrowth then involves raising complex questions about issues such as the commons, about equality, about redistribution, and thereby also very sticky questions about values, about convictions. So there are no factual or straightforward or single answer to these questions. Rather, they are open for disagreement, for conflict, for differences, and for the struggle of foregrounding and naming many different possible futures. But exactly this struggle between alternatives is essential because it highlights that we are not stuck on a conveyor belt towards a predetermined and inevitable future. So you can say that the climate crisis stories that combines these kind of apocalyptic environmental visions with a hegemonic neoliberal view of a predetermined social order constitute one particular fiction. And we need to open up for telling different stories and producing different fictions that can be mobilized for realization. And this is where storytelling and stories and science fiction is central. Stories and science fiction make it possible for us to imagine transformations before they happen. And so they expand the boundaries of what is possible. And thereby they also provide the first step towards action that will make these transformations possible. And of course, this does not mean that we turn away from pragmatic and policy agendas, but on the contrary, they help us develop a wider vision that can provide a context for such debates. For example, by raising fundamental and often neglected questions about society and about processes of societal transformation and what they might become. So this brings me actually to the Efflux series and the essays that we are here to discuss today. Some of these essays are fictional, some are factual, and of course these two things doesn't exclude one another, but all of them elucidate perspectives, visions, and ideas that are often neglected in populist and mainstream debates. So for example, I think the three essays that we will discuss today all somehow centers around a notion of care. Now, notions of care are often ignored, overlooked, and even devaluated in the paradigm of economic growth. The paradigm and the language of efficiency and productivity is often not applicable where care is involved. Of course, there are few or even no productivity gains that are possible through care work. So, yet, of course, care is central to repair the damages that we have caused to each other and the planet. And so maybe we should stop talking about the climate and start talking about care. And so I'll end with a question that we might pick up in the discussion later, which is, how can architecture and urbanism help to care for and repair a broken planet? And with that, I'll give over to you.
Thank you, Cecilia and Hannah, and thank you all for coming to this. I think it's probably the last part of the Triennale of the, or the resurrection. I'm not sure. Even before humankind first saw a photograph of the whole Earth, and the Club of Rome met to write about its limits, we have long known that infinite growth is impossible. Yet the critique of growth has fueled powerful reactions that have taken place both in and to our built environment, from deregulation and degradation to speculation, derivation, and exclusion, of course. Architects and urban practitioners toiling daily at the coalface of economic expansion are complicit in the perpetuation of growth. The question here is whether they're also in a position to contribute towards a move away from it. These few sentences were actually taken from our editorial that we wrote together, the curators of the Triennale and Nick Axel and I from Efflux Architecture. And this series that where you can see here a kind of glimpse of the last, I don't know how to move this, but I will just keep it like that. This series raised the question of what architects can do or what we can all do, but of course many doubts remain. I'm not sure whether we have found answers, but maybe asked some questions. We have invited authors from a wide range of different fields, practicing architects, of course, like Ketil from Snoheta, or Carl Otto Elefsson, who you all know here, also from Aho, who together with Tarald Lundevall wrote Rural Dilemmas, or Anna Pujaner from Barcelona, just to name a few. Then also architects, activists like Sandy Hilal or Amika Dal from Assemble. Then also engineers, which I think is a very important part of the discussion, purely for the reasons also that were just named by Cecilia, because they seem to be part of the answer, but of course they're not. They're partly the problem, yet I would argue we still need them somehow. At least we need some interesting engineers, and I think we had one really quite exciting contribution by Transolar and by Matthias Schuler, an engineer who works very much as a climate engineer for buildings. I think he was also at the beginning part of the team at the Dijkman Library here in Oslo. Then, of course, degrowth scholars and activists such as Angelos Varvarosis and Penny Kotrolikou. And I think what was really very fruitful in a way was this very performative approach to a certain extent that the curators of the Triennale took. And here we had as a contributor to the series Stefan Kagi from Rimini Protocol, and they did a huge work here for the Triennale, sorry. And then, of course, also architectural historians and theorists like Mark Jasenbeck, who speculated about the end of the quadrivium, as he called it, which meant the end of the modernist materials, concrete, glass, steel, and rubber. Or other writers like Isabelle Doucet on anticipating fabulous futures, or Daniel Barber. And for the selection of authors, which is of course a certain process that where actually many people took part. Imagine, I think we were 8 people, 7, 8 people trying to agree on a list of authors. It took almost as long as the whole project, and but I think in the end we found really interesting contributors, and it's not only because of the topics that they represent, but also partly as a reflection of the geographies that in very different ways struggle with the topic of growth. And so we had, of course, a certain, as Hannah mentioned, a certain focus on Scandinavia, which I think also made total sense to give it a certain visibility also. But of course, we also wanted to include many authors from the Global South. And I remember very vividly the first conference that we had here at Aho, where we had Edgar Pieterse from South Africa, a sociologist and urban planner, who was here with us in the first conference, and he made clear that, I quote, "The long-standing debates around degrowth or anti-growth ring profoundly hollow in many geographies, such as African neighborhoods and cities marked by long-term exclusion. The necessary discourse and exploration of degrowth is crucial, but arguably a unique burden of the global class of overconsumers." And I think that's probably a kind of dilemma that we all face when we talk about the issues that we are trying to debate tonight. And so probably will not come up with answers, but maybe it's another opportunity to talk about the dilemmas and maybe also to take the courage to talk about the future. Tonight we have the pleasure to have 3 of our authors with us, and they address the topic of growth in very different ways, but I think there are some common nominators here. Ingrid Helsing-Almas contributed the essay "No App for That," which was pretty in the beginning of the series, and we just found out it was 2018, so it seems like ages ago. Ingrid is an architect, writer, and critic. She was the chief editor of Architecture N from 2004 to 2017, and is currently, I'm not sure whether currently, I think it was probably right in 2018, but are you still senior advisor for, wonderful, for Doga Design Architecture Norway? And then, of course, Helen Runting, who together with Hélène Frichot wrote The Queue, really a fantastic text, who Helen is an architectural theorist and planner, and also founding partner of the Stockholm-based architectural practice secretary, and also a frequent suspect in biennales. There was also just coming back from the Shenzhen Biennale. And finally, Anna Mill from Mill and Jones, who contributed the graphic novel, in a way, to the series, Exile's Letter. Together with Luke Jones, she leads the London-based studio Mill and Jones, a design practice. They are the authors of yeah, it's the novels, graphic novels, very much about, in a broader sense, about cities, technology, the future, some fragments of the past, and yeah. But I think we will hear more about this and the context of your practice later on. But we thought we might start with Ingrid, somehow. To a certain extent, also addressing the local situation partly, and putting this into the larger context, followed then by Helen and then Anna, and we will then find the opportunity to have a conversation among us, and also, of course, to discuss with all of you these pressing and urgent topics. So please give a warm welcome to Ingrid.
Doesn't really matter. Well, enormously, but because it's already open. Ja, ikke sant. Det er noe her. Anyway, it doesn't get very exciting for a little while, so it doesn't really matter. Just you guys sort yourself out, and I'll just start. So the task that I was given by the editors of e-flux was a degrowth manifesto for Oslo, which is not really what I did. It's interesting looking back at the essay now, a year and a half later. Oh, you've given it away now. Anyway, where I find that what I did was a kind of hamburger essay, where in the middle was all the stuff that you guys asked me to do, like say something about Oslo because you're the only local writer that we have. So yes, so in the middle of the essay is a kind of story about Oslo, which is interesting for visitors, maybe also readable for locals, I don't know, but it's about Oslo, it's physical constants, you know, the fjord, the rivers, the mountains, the surrounding forest, etc., and social constants as well, somehow something about the local culture, how we see ourselves, certain characteristics about Oslo society, etc. And then the most interesting part now, at least to me, when I read it, is the bun of the hamburger, as it were, the beginning and the end, which are some speculations about cities and growth and the idea of a city and how that somehow drives development. The reason why it's called No App for That, which was editor's choice, is because it starts with a citizen's service app called Fix Gata Mi, Fix My Street, where citizens can register when they find holes in the streets and things like that, when there are things missing. So it's a kind of register of disappointments in the city and things that should be, you know, that should be other than what they are. And it's interesting because, of course, a city can never be fixed. So the whole image of a finished city is a fallacy. No city in history has ever been finished. A city cannot be finished ever. So the idea that it can be somehow fixed, just as long as you get, you know, all the holes registered and filled, is wrong. And it demonstrates very clearly the idea of development that drives a lot of how we think about cities. That we think of it as a linear progression towards a definable end. Of course, it isn't. A city is a number of small actions and reactions, different kinds of decisions and ideas and innovations and wear and tear, all happening, a whole layer of processes all happening at once. But this is not the story or the reality on which we base the government of cities or the construction of cities. That's not how we think about cities, even though we all know if you know, once you look at the hole in the street and the fallacy of completion, you know that that's not possible. So we know better, but somehow we still work on this fantasy of the complete city. And the theme of degrowth, then, to me, has to do with accepting this cyclical idea of replacing the idea of linear development towards a goal, which is obviously also the basis for the idea of growth, with a cyclical idea of waxing and waning, of slow accretion, of small decisions that somehow make up both everyday life and also the reality of our physical surroundings. Development is obviously driven by expectation. That's what this app is all about. It's about registering citizens' expectations. but somehow it also it makes us blind to all the expectations that actually matter in a city, where we would expect politics to be better. We would expect to be able to have somewhere to have an app where we could register corruption or inequality or racism, or I mean the things that really matter. Who cares about the holes in the street, you know, when there are those huge unsolved issues? And somehow it seems, you know, we don't have the same kind of system for those kinds of expectations. I didn't actually include this in the essay, but I would like to tell you a little Oslo degrowth story as a contribution to this evening's discussion, that somehow say something about both accretion, about expectation, and more importantly about value. These are some boots, as you can see, that were given to my daughter. She was about 6 at the time, I guess, 5 or 6 years old. And they were given to her by an older friend, and she loved them. They are black suede, as you can see, not very practical in an Oslo winter, you know, but they had a little bit of a high heel and they were just irresistible. And she totally loved them. She was allowed to wear them to kindergarten if the weather wasn't too bad, etc. So one of the zippers broke because they were hand-me-downs, so they were a little bit worn. And we took them to the, what's it called, the shoemaker, the cobbler, the shoe repairman. Well, I say shoe repairman, it says skomaker Morsli above his door, shoemaker Morsli. But behind the counter in the shop is a number of members of a family of clearly Asian origin who repair suitcases and everything that Norwegian very expensive craftsmen can no longer be bothered to deal with. And they do a fantastic job, and the owner of the shop informed me that the repair would be maybe more than 200 kroner, so I might want to consider actually buying a new pair of boots. Because repairing the old ones clearly wouldn't be lønne seg, as it wouldn't be worth it. So what are we faced with here? My daughter wanted these boots. She wanted the boots that she had been given by her friend. Those were the ones that had value to her. A repair of the boots would also clearly save, you know, the raw materials and the production of a new pair of boots and the environmental cost of that. My child would learn that repairing things is possible. And the work would also help to, you know, keep alive a low-cost service that the city is not actually very rife with today, so that seemed worth doing. Giving them, the family of repairmen and repair women, their daily bread, as it were. So measured against all other scales of value than the number of Norwegian kroner I happen to or have or not have in my pocket, repairing these boots was absolutely worth it. So, of course, we did, you know, and we paid the 200 kroner and got them repaired. So it seems to me that in order to make degrowth a reality, it's those scales of value that we really need to discuss. What is worth it in the larger scale of things? And especially in architecture, where everything is measured against very conventional value scales of time and cost, that really seems to be an absolutely enormous challenge that I would like to discuss in the coming debate. Thanks very much.
I can also start while we get this running. My name's Helen Runting. I am a planner and architectural theorist based in Stockholm. I wish that I had like a vocoder on this microphone so that I could amplify my voice double, because I speak with someone else's voice as well, and that's the amazing Hélène Frichot, who I wrote this text with. So if you can imagine that vocoded effect, that would be wonderful. Right, I'm just going to jump straight into it. This is a text that we wrote addressing, we could say, the ideology of abundance and the image of abundance, and the critique that might be posed from a feminist perspective. To wait in line is not to know the bouncer or the restaurant owner on a first name basis. It is to have arrived late, to have misjudged the dress code, to not have a high enough loyalty card status. To have to queue is a sign that one arrived wrongly. You know this. You know this. This text is addressed to a fictional character who is addressed as you, somewhat unfair to the audience, I know. You know this and have made a habit of avoiding such situations. You instead demonstrate your good judgment, your flexibility, and your insider knowledge. You are a member of the digitally literate millennial generation, even if you would not call yourself that. It's true, you are more mobile, even if this is a term that you have little affinity for. You are more mobile, more nomadic than the generations that have come before you. You have more occasion to practice arriving, perhaps, than your parents did. You're certainly more unsettled and definitely more unencumbered than them, than your older siblings, than their friends even. You're at peace with the idea that you are unlikely to own your own home, just as you are unlikely to maintain one career, one job, one employer, one partner, or one city your whole life. Much like the rhetoric that dominated Swedish housing policy in the post-war era, well before you were born, you reject the idea that property ownership is a universal aspiration. Not, however, and this is an important difference, because you believe, like they did back then, that housing should not be treated as a profit-generating commodity, but because ownership for you is a flickering and amorphous impulse to be met within the confines of the now. The right now. The right now. Real estate is not something that you queue for. You seek out real estate opportunities in the moment through services you subscribe to, using financial vehicles that you have purchased and an interface on your smartphone that connects you to your AI broker. This is the dream of prop tech, and this is not science fiction. This is already here. So the first scenario that we confront the reader with in this essay relates to the prop tech sector, which is composed of innovative startups and young entrepreneurial ventures, which promise to reshape the ownership of property in ways that make the real of real estate rather more spectral than solid. Like the hype around Bitcoin-driven ventures, and this is a blockchain technology, the affective logic of prop tech lands us in a celebration of the hyper-individuated entrepreneurial subject who invests in the ideology of a purportedly debt-free sharing economy. Everyone can participate in prop tech. This is an inclusive community. Your participation, moreover, can be vanishingly small, spare change, really. So the fractionalized, blockchain-enabled real estate products of prop tech, so many great words from the Silicon Valley kids, are less buildings, though, than instances of financialized capital atomized. The real estate on offer targets the immaterial satisfaction of existential needs by feeding a speculative impulse. You are invited to partake in the real estate game not at the scale of property measured in square meters, but by way of infinitesimal small chunks of circulating capital that are pegged to spatial products elsewhere. Just one click and you can share with your virtual and anonymous participatory community in the ownership of an apartment in Rio de Janeiro, a condo in Miami, or a pad in the ultimate city for PropTech, Manhattan. or part of a city. This is a mood-altering architecture that is available in microdoses. You inhabit its spaces mentally in fleeting and snatched moments of screen time. You can withdraw whenever you feel like it because you are the kind of person that never has to wait. There is, however, of course, a problem with this image, because wait you do. So, the video that I'm showing you, oh, it's not playing. Oh, that was sad. Can we skip forward a little bit? I was like thinking there was all this flickering happening next to me. I was trying to be on time. Okay, yeah, good. That's perfect. Yeah. That's good. Is the cursor moving is the question. Yeah. That was meant to be the introduction. Don't worry, there's no narrative to follow here. You're just lost in the internet. But while you're waiting and while you're trading in these fractions, these prop tech atomized fractions of real estate, atoms of Manhattan lofts, of global property portfolios, tiny little bites of apartments, chances are you're still waiting in queue for another type of apartment, one that is whole enough, large enough to hold you while your mind and your capital wander, one that can be yours for years and not for seconds. So despite the affective sense of a glut that haunts the Nordic, here I guess I'm making assumptions, we could say the Swedish real estate context following the recent construction boom, and we wrote this just before it had officially died. And despite your recent plunge into prop tech investment, you find yourself lacking an apartment in the here and now. You wait through the summer, you wait through the autumn, you wait through the long winter, and you wait well into the spring. Your point of access into this queue is the website of the Stockholm housing agency, Bostadsförmedlingen, a municipality-owned organisation. This agency constitutes a kind of apartment exchange, conveying contracts for apartments that are owned by the municipal housing associations and sometimes private actors. The Swedish Property Federation has an agreement with the Swedish Union of Tenants, this is all very welfare state infrastructure, that recommends that its members convey half of all apartments through the agency. Municipal housing companies use this means of exchange for the vast majority of their rental apartments. And it is this interface that forms the primary point of contact between Stockholm's citizens and the non-means tested rental system. The digital queue is prime late welfare state prop tech. You log in, you verify your identity. It's very exciting. I hope that we've done that already, yes. Using mobile bank ID, and then you start to browse. At your average income level, you are eligible to apply for 149 vacant apartments on the day that we wrote this paper, and I saw it was much, much more today, although 197 seems to be where I got in this video. These range between one-bedroom studio apartments and four-room apartments, and they're scattered across the greater Stockholm region. So unlike the queue to a popular restaurant, a club, or a flight, beyond providing pay slips to prove your income and a document from the Swedish tax agency to prove your household size, you, thankfully, will not be able to influence this decision. There are so few times that happens. This effectively removes the middle-class skills your parents instilled into you at the dinner table of deliberative negotiation. Your education, your ability to charm, your skills in gaming the system do not make your time worth more than anyone else's. You check the queue every morning. You spend Sunday mornings roaming across its map. You try to game its interface. It seems like every Sunday, amidst these 150-odd apartments, one of them at least will be yours. Why? Because you, even in your abject sense of lack, can be discerning, smart, and cunning. So in this essay, we try to address this infrastructure and this interface in terms of the, let me see how I'm going here. In terms of the dreams and the affective infrastructures that it's playing off. We're really interested in this notion of gamification of the interface itself. We're very interested in what this has done to the practice of waiting. So, quote, and here I'm quoting Joseph Vogel, "While financial markets strive for secular eternity, while their subjects dream of transcending their own mortality, and while capital itself is impelled to vanquish the obscure forces of time and eliminate the obstacles in its path to an unlimited future, striving is always haunted by measurable terms, by fixed appointments, by due payments, in short, by the conditions of historical time." So what does this waiting, this constant practice of unending waiting, 10.5 years is the average time one waits in the queue for an apartment. What does this mean? Why would you do it? Are you mad? You can always buy, or so they say. And here enters the spectre of the indebted woman or man, depending on whether you're listening to Elena and I or Maurizio Lazzarato. But even lifelong debt, we'd like to make a point here, a mortgage on an apartment that will never ever be paid back, increasingly turns out to be a privilege that's reserved for a successful few. So, supported by what remains of the Swedish welfare state, accessible childcare, generous parental leave, etc., etc., Swedes continue to breed, continue to move to large cities, and continue to wait in an ever-expanding queue. The question of housing thus must be considered in the face of a general crisis, both globally and locally, that's affecting the everyday existences and the macro scale of irreversible environmental transformations. Housing must be considered from the standpoint of an affective politics. And again, how might we then, if we're to pose a question to this situation, resist the extraction of existential time implied in all of these technologies? How am I going for time? I had my video timed for like the right amount. Now I'm a bit like, where am I? Is it okay if I sum up? So amidst the anticipation and the distraction of a decade of waiting, the promise of happiness can wax and wane. The involuntary anticipation of active waiting, of waiting in the queue whilst trying to game it, may easily turn to dread. Uncertainty ultimately pervades the spectrum of these effects, and the consequences of the normalization of uncertainty is a permanent state of low-level panic. Fear, as Bifo Berardi reminds us, which attaches to particular objects, is replaced by a more generalized anxiety, an environmental anxiety, a constant twitching and an inability to settle. Mark Fisher more darkly observed, "We are bored even as we are fascinated, and the limits of distraction the limitless distractions allow us to evade confronting death even as it is closing in on us." So we start to go in a dark point here. My last two paragraphs though. If you are in the queue, however, you continue to be fed images of surplus, and this is where we attempt to kind of grapple with this notion of overgrowth. 150 new apartments per week run through your mind. Despite the attempt to equitably and anonymously allocate this spatial resource, something that I personally feel very strongly and emotionally about, the interface itself is structured around the illusion of choice, around the notion of the glut, around politics of plenty. This active waiting that asks of its waiting subjects to put aside notions of collective ownership or political claims and rather ask them to indulge in soothing microdoses of the sensation of abundance and wait politely. What do we see in this except a kind of mirror of a prop tech interface? The Swedish rental system is in a state of crisis. But how are we to move forward if our aim is not dismantlement, deregulation, withdrawal, or abdication? A queue is as good a way as any to guarantee the distribution of spatial resources in a manner that short-circuits prejudice, discrimination, and racial profiling, amongst other forms of profiling. But what such a queue must offer us, and where it must leave the gamified nature of many, many other interfaces behind, is an acknowledgement that those who are waiting in the queue are also active subjects. Often they're waiting in precarious circumstances, in overcrowded rooms, in illegally rented apartments for years. What the queue must offer from the standpoint of an affirmative feminist critique, we offer in closing then, is in fact rather polite. If it is to resist the deadly fantasy of the possibility of a human life without a space to live within, it must offer the bodies that stand in its line a place to wait. What that place might look like constitutes, I would say, a feminist challenge that I hope and believe strongly that the architectural discipline may in fact be quite well equipped to deal with. Thank you.
Hello. Hello. Hi, my name's Anna Mill. I'm a architecturally trained artist and designer based in London. I teach architecture as well at London Met and sometimes at the AA school also. But together with my partner Luke Jones, we create graphic novels or short comics, which always are very architecturally infused. They consider cities and world building with a kind of architectural lens. And I think what I find interesting is that for me the process of developing these stories seems very similar to the start of any design project. So whether it's an image or a whole book, I draw out all of these ideas, and they're small or large stories that explore architectural space. To me, these drawings are a design tool, actually, and it's in constructing these rough outlines and then carefully and considerately kind of filling in all of the details and the minutiae of everyday life that you really understand what the potential of that space could be. I do these drawings for architects as well, so I do their competition images, but what's delightfully different to me, and when I do it for fiction, is that in architects' images, usually the characters have to behave in a way that the architects expect. Whereas when I do these drawings for fiction, the characters can misuse the space and they can do surprising things. And I think that actually it's much more when you first design the space and then allow people to do unusual and surprising things in it that you really get a much deeper and richer understanding of what it is that you're proposing. And it's these imperfect futures that I really enjoy constructing. And quite often, though, it's actually in the very small things. So it's in thinking about what the small problems, like the everyday stresses of the inhabitants in these new or altered worlds might have. It's the boring chores and the broken and mended objects. Things that are strangely familiar or strangely different in these new places. And you spend such a long time with these worlds as you're drawing it, as you're making these projects, that to me this seems like the way that I can really kind of get an understanding of the potential of that place and a proper concept of the lives that could be lived in it. So this particular story that we wrote is called Exile's Letter. It's very short, it's just 16 pages long, and it's a sort of narrative poem with a kind of comic book setting. It's set in a future where teams of people are reforming and repairing the complex tapestry of the Earth's surface, but actually it's mostly about a friendship. And it's a friendship seen across 3 different periods of these people's lives. And at first, when we start, they're very young and they're doing kind of experimental ad hoc processes. They're trying to fix the poisoned earth, but only in these kind of small experimental ways. And then at a certain point, their lives kind of take different paths, and they're working on a kind of, well, they're working on different paths, but it's in a kind of disaster-prone world. And then later on, the systems and the ideas that they came up with earlier have been kind of accepted, but taken out of their hands, and they're now in this kind of new age where massive terraforming projects are going on, but they no longer need their active participation. So the characters now have time to reflect, but also time to become anxious about what it is that they've started and whether things are continuing in the way that they would have liked. So now I think I'll just read out the story as we look at the slides. Old friend. Remember how we built a temple on the edge of a mud-soaked rill to keep the sun off our backs as we worked, dedicated to the spirits of the unseen future, those gods yearning for rebirth. Nothing in those days was ever easy. Healing the poisoned land, quickening moss, worms and tubers, seeding the inscrutable clay. The value of our sacrilege against an all too human past. We were in love with the image of our own absence, suturing together the plants and rock, filling the air with its drone. The earth repatterned in a strange speckling complexity. We saw no one that summer, only the images of 100 other workers on other islands. We spoke of little but the ruin of the past. Every imagined desecration of tradition held the radiance of shattered glass. The night before we closed the door for 100 years, fortifications built against ourselves, bastions against human encroachment, the outer face of the unseen future expanding like a bubble before us. Sorry, I've gone out of order. That's okay. I had to go on building, you had to go on moving. You said, never stay long enough to make a dent in the earth. 4 years to build a town that you told me had no future. Cross purposes and negotiations, resentment and silences, but emerging beneath the noise, an echo of the old thing I remembered. All burned in 4 hours, dry summer, stray spark, flames against the darkening sky. Built again, and swallowed half formed by the water that winter, but you came walking out of the flood. We were building something we could only half imagine, a life miraculously self-contained, mirror image of its own best intentions, a weightless infrastructure, floating in the earth like foam on the sea, and dreaming of its own future irrelevance. I have watched the video only once, the hillside moving, then falling away. Your shout on the tape, more like laughter than alarm. Now every night the past engulfs me, like 500 tons of loosened shale and slurry. But I shake it off, time's vertigo, begin morning chores, soak brushes, spill tea, seeding and nurturing each slowly unwinding process, a net thrown over our absence, expanding, filling the void with its rhythms, and at its end, I see you there, the unbuilding complete, your garden in exile, as we struggle to follow you, fight to burrow into obscurity, leave history's control room, lock the door and walk away. Look out onto the early days of 1,000-year restitution, the elk on the ridgeline, the scent of plants underfoot, rocks under the sky, drawing one another into an intricate and exclusive conspiracy beyond our reach or understanding.
Maybe, yes, you can have this one. Maybe this one to moderate. Okay.
This one doesn't work.
This works, yes. I prefer that one.
No, do both.
Yes, both work.
So I take one and the other one.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for the short presentations, which I think were quite interesting, also in the sense that I think you all somehow insisted on a social practice which is somehow at odds partly with the question of climate change and growth in general. And but to me, when we look around the conflicts and debates on climate change and growth, since we took the notion of growth as a kind of starting point relating to the curatorial approach, it's also quite interesting to what extent some of the conflicts, if you think about the yellow vests in France, for instance, the protests started actually after a kind of, let's call it a climate change law proposed by the French government, and then the protests started by people who actually need a car to go to work, usually not very well paid work, basically commuters. So I think this, and there are thousands of examples where somehow it feels, when we talk about growth, there's an assumption that growth guarantees a certain wealth, or this is the mechanism of the production of wealth in the countries of the northern west, I would say, of the globe. And in order to have an impact on the question of climate, and it seems for many people that as if there's a conflict between climate policy on the one hand and a question of economy on the other hand. And maybe Norway is a particularly good example in a way. I think you pointed this out, Anna, that it feels as if Norway is interesting because it reflects a kind of dilemma or an almost luxurious schizophrenic situation. On the one hand, when you look around Oslo or other parts of Norway, probably the highest percentage of e-cars in the world. On the other hand, this pro-climate policy, if you want, is fueled by oil production. And I think recently the Norwegian state also decided to start a new oil field, which would, for the next decades, guarantee wealth. So it's as if only the production of oil guarantees also an advanced ecological agenda, which is totally schizophrenic in a way. But maybe there's a good logic into it. I'm trying to understand it. Maybe Ingrid, sorry for taking you as the local here, but can you tell us something about this dilemma, or what do you think about that conflict in a way?
Thank you for the enormous question. I think it is exactly that. It is a dilemma. And the logic or lack of logic is exactly as you have identified it. I was just looking at the paper a couple of days ago. The story is that in the scale of things, they burn so much coal in China that they dig out of the ground, but in China and Australia and other places, that it's better that we extract the oil sustainably, or using minimum, we have electrified the oil extraction and we do it as kind of with as low energy as you can, it's better that we do that than that people burn Australian surface extraction coal. That's the argument. That's the ecological argument, as far as I can understand it. Now, you know, if you look 50 years ahead in the future or 100 years, that whole logic falls apart. And everybody knows that. So it's walking backwards into the future, and it is exactly what it seems.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting exactly what you're saying, Ingrid, about that everyone knows this. We all know this. And it's funny because the whole climate discussion, it's so saturated with consensus. Like, we all agree on these dangers. We all agree that this is not good. And yet, nothing is happening. And why? And it's interesting that you were mentioning the yellow vests in France, because what is also interesting is that the moment that someone starts, you know, making a fuss about these things, about the consensus, ultimately start questioning a certain consensus, then what does Macron do? He says, oh, well, I need to declare a state of emergency. So it's like the exception is that people are actually saying against the consensus and actually making a fuss about things. So it's really, I think, the biggest kind of challenge we have with the climate discussion is exactly because it's so depoliticized. It's so full of this consensus-seeking agreement that doesn't allow, that all it wants is to establish business as usual. But we need to disrupt that and actually insist on disrupting business as usual by insisting on alternatives.
I think that was also a bit what you hinted at, or well, more than hinted at, Helen, that talking about housing as an example, is the solution is probably not the production of more houses. Because within the realm of overgrowth, what are solutions? Because we all know cities grow enormously, so there is a consumption and overproduction of built space. So also then the number, the square meter numbers that each of us uses, it's actually increasing. There are more and more households just by one person. So also our type of freedom, how we define it, very often means, hey, I need my own apartment. And so in large cities like Oslo, I'm sure there's almost 50% one man, one woman households, like in every big city in the West. So is that the answer? More production, or as Cecilia said, a systemic change?
I think the housing question is an interesting one, because I guess after a century of modernism and within architecture, kind of, I guess everyone in this room has been trained in that tradition where we understand that the environment is part of a calculation that produces us as subjects. Right? I mean, architecture fundamentally is part of the recipe that produces us. And it's a little bit funny that if that is the case, and we believe so clearly in architecture's capacity, that we then don't extend that analysis to think about how we might organize our environment to produce a society that gives a shit about each other, for instance. Could be one question we might pose to ourselves. And so I guess my paper was a little bit about, I think in other work I've been working on this analysis of neoliberalism, that we're being sold the lack of something. And that's one of the driving kind of motivating forces, I think, behind the individuation that happens there. And so if we're sold on a lack, we're stuck. And then we lack this machine that could produce us as better, and we sit and we wait and we get depressed. And my question here is, what do we do with our bodies in that time? I mean, I think that everybody who lacks a house in Stockholm right now, and they're not homeless, but people are sleeping on people's couches at the moment. There's a serious kind of scarcity problem. If we have to wait, what do we do with our time? That's my question. Because I do actually think that we may need to build. I do actually think that we may need to radically reconstruct an environment around us. I'm not sure that reducing production of housing, that's not going to solve it, sure, but I do think there's going to have to be a radical reconstruction project, but that reconstruction may not align with a kind of logic of growth or economic growth specifically. So I guess I'm a little bit in a different territory here. I'm not arguing against the production of architecture, actually.
Yeah. Like most architects. Anna, how would you address this context, coming also from a very particular practice? But I think it was interesting to see in the graphic novel and somehow a certain focus on friendship, on storytelling, which also goes away from basically measuring growth or degrowth or CO2 or whatsoever, because we live in a debate which is very much about numbers, and you shift this to a very to the small scale of friendship between two people, but of course also the large scale. So they work basically on a prototype, healing the earth, and but it also shows in a way that the story might not end well because the prototype produces some kind of an evil thing, maybe.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know what the answers are, of course, but I think that for me, what the reason why I think that fiction can be useful, and it's not to say that the other kind of more academic ways of having these discussions can't do this as well, but for me it seems to be the way that I seem to be able to best be able to communicate some of these anxieties is through a kind of fictional telling of them. And I think that what that has a kind of very, well, I think a unique power in is that when we stay in the kind of realms of a scientific debate where we're talking about numbers and we're talking about things that we logically can understand are happening to people, you know, that the fact of what we're consuming has these effects on these other people on another part of the earth. We also have a bit of a inability, it seems to me, to kind of really understand the truth of that, but fiction can help you kind of collapse the distance between lives lived in different parts of the world or lives lived kind of round the corner from each other, but in kind of completely different spheres. And it seems to me that that's a kind of important power that fiction has.
Oh, that was a bit back. I think it's so wonderful with your perspective, and I really love your novel and to have that perspective, which was so important for us with the Triennale, to show and to use that as a way of thinking differently beyond the numbers, beyond the facts, and the way also, Helen, you were talking about effect. So the way that these things affects us and bodily, not just in a kind of like the rational way of thinking, but how these are very embodied within us. And that said, I think it's important. I just wanted to make a quick comment about degrowth is not about reducing architecture. Obviously, it's not about. It's to rethink what is architecture, or architecture is about creating spaces for people to live in, and who are then better put in a position to think about how do we redistribute the space, because it's not that we don't have enough space. We have so much space. We have so much housing, but a vast majority of the housing in Europe, or not a majority, but a lot of housing in Europe is empty. It's no one are living there because it's used as a speculation. Like in London, where the housing crisis is so big, in some of the poorest districts, there are so many flats empty because of foreign investment that are just sitting on these houses and leaving them empty just to gain profit. So it's really about thinking, and as you were talking about, like the redistribution or the reconstruction of all these spaces to allow for everyone to have what they need. And that is what is interesting also, because neoliberalism is about choice, the freedom of choice. But what actually, we need to have a freedom for what we need, not for what we want, but for what we actually fundamentally need. And that is a big difference.
I think I want to probably raise a question expanding on what was just said. Ingrid, you mentioned at one point, you said a city cannot be fixed, which I think is an interesting point, because we are talking about planning, and those who are architects here know that planning traditionally always implied an end goal. Yeah, so it's a project is something that's thrown into the future, and then you work backwards in a way from this ideal state of things. And you said rightly that a city cannot be fixed, but I wonder and I agree, but at the same time, what we experience right now with this rapid technological change that's happening at the same time is that more and more things are measured, registered. There are actually very little things that are not part of a measurability that's computerized of dynamic models. I think that's another real problem, I think, in this whole debate when we talk about, well, choices that we have, but it feels that we have less and less choices because we're already part of a new dynamic apparatus. How would you deal with that problem that apparently there's not much left with all the... We can, of course, argue that, of course, we have to change things. Yeah, sure. Everybody would agree, as you said. There's a consensus about this, but at the same time, the apparatus is taking over more and more space and digits, etc. And I think, I would love to know what you think about that.
I'm not sure if I quite understand what it is you want me to think about, but I would like to go back to...
I'm talking about BIM and other things as a planning tool.
But all those things, I want to go back to what you said about being sold a lack. I think that is extremely, that is really at the heart of consumer society, at the heart of consumer culture. I think what we don't see, which I think somehow is what you're addressing, is that we don't see that we are free to not buy it. You know, you don't have to. You really don't. And it is our choice, and we don't use it. But that's more a citizen's. Citizen's point of view.
Yeah, but I'd be interested in take the small example that you were showing, the shoes. Yeah. I think I understand this on a personal level, the story. But how can you avoid that this is becoming a commercial idea by someone who's producing a new app? Because there is, going back to the title that you had in your text, unfortunately there is almost for everything an app, which is of course not an answer to what we want or need, but unfortunately it's an answer that we use.
Yeah, but that's fine. Some of them are useful, some of them are not useful. You know, this is the same with every tool.
Yeah, but they're not innocent. What I'm trying to say is that the commodification of almost everything or more things, and it will continue maybe with feelings and with very private things. So how would that world... because there's an enormous growth. When we talk about growth, this is a real growth industry. And so how would that intervene with the personal level, but also these so-called choices that we said that we are free to choose? Are we free to choose?
Well, I think
I'm trying to provoke a little bit, because many people around the world, they're not free to choose. So it's a kind of luxury assumption that we are free.
we have a lack of real lack in a way, right? Because we have all our basic, for most of us at least, all our basic needs are fulfilled. But I think the aspect of freedom is extremely central, and it's not really a term that's being used in any great discussion, or to any great extent in public discussion. It's interesting, and I actually wanted to ask you a question, because your introductory piece that you showed from your editor's side for the whole series, that architects are in a unique position to move away from the perpetuation of growth, is what you said. And I would like to talk about the architect's role somehow in this, because we say we, and architects, and this is a really critical point, I think, when architects say we include both ourselves as citizens and ourselves as architects. And those are actually two very different roles. And we mix them up the whole time. So why don't we do something? I'll tell you why we don't do something, because we don't pay for the buildings that we are commissioned to design and from which we make a living. It's very simple. You know, so what is our role in that? So when you say that we are in a position to not perpetuate growth, who does that go for? The people who work in architecture schools, who are free to think and who have, you know, their salary paid not by the hour by a client that give them a particular commission, but it is maybe, you know, the few of us who work on the outside of that. But when you work as a practicing architect now in the business model that we have for architects today, how free are you really? What can you propose? If someone comes to you and say, I want a building, it has to be yay big and it's going to cost no more than this, how free are you really? You know, and if that is not your role, how free are you as an architect to define yourself, to define your activity in a different way, in a different sphere, and you know, make a different kind of contribution? People are doing it, you know, but that's still a minority. So I think that is something.
I think
that
that's
I would
a
really
very good
like
question.
Also,
because
so my first question is to you: what did you mean when you say that architects are in a unique position to not perpetuate, to move away from the perpetuation of growth? What did you mean when you said that?
This was, of course, a slightly optimistic assumption, yeah. But because I guess it would have been more correct to put a question mark there. But what was meant, of course, that architects are somehow involved as practitioners in the building and production of space, and quite literally very often. And around 40% of the CO2 numbers comes from the built environment. So it's quite a number. So, but in a strange way, architects don't feel at ease to actually address this question. They would probably rather discuss electric cars, or maybe shift the discussion to a different field. And I'm sure that we are, or that's my perception, that we as architects are not well equipped to actually deal with this. Of course, we can reject jobs. I think this would be one thing. The other is probably an expansion into fields that that feel a bit unattractive, because many of the changes or potentials lie within the field of law and regulations. And so maybe bureaucracy has to become very sexy in the future, because
very
now
feminist, very feminist bureaucracy. I think it's the way forward.
Yeah, because I think because the law.
I think I prefer a feminist bureaucracy. Maybe it can be sexy too, but like I think it's got to be feminist first. For me, I just wanted to respond to this question actually, and it's just a proposition because I'm a bit tired. I'm sitting here and I'm in Oslo and I feel like speculating right now. But isn't there something here about the fetish object of the building itself as an individualized kind of chunk that perhaps needs to be rejected if architecture is to do something else? And it's I think here is where I would like very much oppose, for instance, Pier Vittorio Aureli's opposition between the city, this space of flow, and then the absolute object. I see no political potential in the absolute object. I'm really
totally
interested
agree.
in
The problem is that Google would also agree with you. Google Sidewalks, their project, their project for Toronto, etc., is anti-object. I think the problem is that we have the wrong allies, if you argue.
But try to do watch what the big architecture offices in Sweden, the kind of critique that they receive for monotony, for repetition, for a lack of individuality, for poor design when they're designing for the masses. There's a class question here. As soon as housing is oriented towards the multiple, and particularly the working classes, it becomes critiqued as being ugly. And I think that we really need to think about what we want architecture to do on an aesthetic level, and potentially there's a huge discussion here to be had about the unique object. I think that might be one starting point. When it comes to bureaucracy, that's another question. As a planner, I'd love to speak to that theme forever, but then we get into the notion of regulation, right? And this is about a collective decision about limiting certain freedoms and certain production of freedoms, I think. But that's a political question. I don't think that that's something we can talk about in a panel discussion necessarily on a universal level. We could talk about it in terms of Stockholm municipality today in relation to one project. I'm not 100% comfortable with putting on a kind of global project for a feminist bureaucracy on the table right here. But yeah, I just wanted to maybe start with the critique of the fetish object, maybe, I think, and the class project of emancipation, maybe. That's a pretty big project. We could go with that one.
But I think the object is a super interesting topic, because there is, of course, quite a lot of discussions these days, and many texts who take the position of the anti-object, or the building being totally interwoven into a very complex environment. But I'm repeating myself a little bit, unfortunately, that Google is actually, their project is exactly this. They get rid of the object and weave it into the flow of information. And this is where I think before it was also mentioned the notion of care. I think you mentioned it, which I think is a super interesting topic, because it shows or it opens up a possibility of dealing with things in a more careful way, with people, etc. But at the same time, unfortunately, it has to do with facility management. Yeah, it's becoming facility management. So people are taking care, and organizations that we actually don't want them to take care of that. That's important to us, but they will. Or we'll have to find instruments to take these things out of the market, to protect them, to give right to the people.
What things?
Things like not only cleaning, but also heating in buildings, all the regulations that are coming up now. That's a dangerous thing in the debate about climate, that there will be new laws, new regulations on behalf of climate, so to speak, but they will turn against us as users or as inhabitants of buildings. They will control, they will probably give reports from your fridge directly to the hospital. Do you own your information, your movements in the building, the use of the apparatus? Google, I think there's a reason why Google bought, it's not only doing Google here on the web, but they buy heating systems, etc., because this is the access to your apartment. And I think this is the interesting question for me in the discussion about growth that you raised as curators of this Triennale. It seems to me, in order to get out of the vicious cycle of growth, one probably has to argue also against the commodification of everything. Or is this part of your project, or less.
Yeah, but I think I think we should be aware and a bit cautious about operating all the time in binaries. I think like growth, I know degrowth in itself is a problem there because it kind of, you think it's anti-growth, so nothing has to grow, like nothing needs to be commodified. We're not against money, it's not against, it's not against commodification per se. It's not like everything that is commodified is bad, like, and some things needs to grow. Children needs to grow, like plants need to grow, things need to grow. Of course, economies in the global south that are really struggling needs to grow too. It's not about saying like, it's not black and white. And I think we were talking also about contradictions earlier. And we need to be comfortable with contradictions. We need to actually be able to make contradictions into something which is productive, to be able to operate in the gray zones. So the way that we deal with contradictions today is that we erase the one side of the contradiction. So, if we don't want growth, then that's anti-growth. And that's really, really unhelpful. The way that we should look at contradictions is a way of thinking critically, a way of insisting on opening up for other possibilities, saying like, oh, this is a contradiction, that's weird, let's use that a productive way to question where we're at and find another way forward, rather than just trying to erase one of the kind of things. So if we say like, then let's, if it's bad with buildings, then let's not build anything. No, let's build differently. And we're so today, it's just so ingrained in the way we're talking and the way that we're discussing this idea actually of a linear progression, or this idea of this one alternative and everything outside it. It's not possible. And it's a way of making things so simple, so oversimple, that we're not able to think critically or think differently anymore. And I think that is kind of a really, really clue. And now I forgot what you were asking me about, because that was so simple.
Can I insert a comment then and bring you into this? Because the issue of fiction I would like to discuss more. Because it's the narrative of growth, the narrative of linear growth, which ties into a lot of the things that you were commenting on, has to be replaced by a narrative of redistribution, to my mind. We only have a finite amount of stuff on the planet, so it needs to be redistributed in order for things to work properly. And the architect's role has to be aligned with that redistribution. I think the students at this school should not be taught how to construct singular objects. What was it you called it? The
fetish object.
Yes,
I was getting all into my class.
Yeah. You can forget about that, because our role will be, in 10, 15 years' time, will be a role of redistribution, not the creator of singular objects with an artistic value in and of themselves, but as actors in a network of complexity. And to replace a narrative with another narrative, what better way than fiction, right? You just have to tell the story differently. So I would like to ask you about your experience of using fiction in that way. Does it work? Or am I just being overly optimistic?
Not so far. I haven't noticed any great impact. But I know.
For example, your relationship with your clients. Or other people's clients, for that matter. Or with your students.
I think that for me, the way that I find design and fiction sort of bizarrely interchangeable at the beginning of a project. I find that it's all the same thing. It's all just imagining something that is not realized yet, but what could be. And sometimes you are able to be so persuasive with this vision that you are able to spin, that you are able to change minds a little. But of course, it's very hard when you're always just bumping up against all of the kind of financial and practical constraints. As an architect, you feel that there's only, in a way, so much that you can do on your own, and it's the same that people have been saying already that there's much bigger society-wide things that need to be addressed, and I feel like in my experience of all of the architects I know, they would all like to be solving these problems, and they would all like to be building in innovative ways which are more sustainable. And you know, if you gave them a chance, they would love to come up with some exciting new way of using material that changes things. Certainly the architects that I know and that I speak to, but they're not given the opportunity to do that. I think the other thing that I was thinking about was, I think this is more of an anecdote, but it's a sort of proof that we have this some of this same difficulties that we've already been discussing with the object and the networks, and how whether an architect is taking the approach of kind of creating this beautiful singular work of art, or whether they're really getting involved in the whole way that the city or a neighborhood is functioning. And I can remember doing a crit with someone, with an older architect who the project was a very carefully done student project where they'd come up with kind of micro living apartments that could be inserted and removed as a kind of like a meanwhile use in a disused big factory building. And the older architect got incredibly angry about this and said, this is not what architects should be doing. This is not what you should be learning in architecture school. You should be learning about making beauty and making beautiful spaces, and you shouldn't be coming up with ways for people to live in smaller and smaller spaces. And obviously, yeah, that's what we would all love to be doing, of course. But also in reality, we can't. Like, there's not that many of those architecture jobs out there that allow you to really do that sort of thing. So should you not then, is it then actually not very valuable as an architect, as an architecture student, to try and address the reality on the ground and come up with a better way to do it that isn't about this beauty and luxury? I don't know. I haven't decided on where I've come out on this argument yet.
Isn't the possibility of fiction, though, to reveal the lie that we've told ourselves? Maybe, I mean, science fiction is always about the now. We, in our office, worked on, or my colleague Rutger Sjögren worked on the scenography for Aniara. I don't know if anyone saw it, the Swedish, very, very depressing Swedish sci-fi movie. It's terribly depressing, but fabulous. Everybody dies. But, I mean, they filmed this, it's no-set sci-fi, so it's filmed in shopping malls and cruise ships and like existing environments. And the effect is to throw one's acceptance of those environments as normal. When you walk out of the cinema into the shopping mall, it's a quite disconcerting sensation. And I think that fiction has that possibility. If we don't need to talk about it in terms of the verfremdungseffekt or get into Brecht or whatever, but like to throw us out of our daily world. And I think that in itself, it might even be enough there. This like critique, this cutting away, stripping away of the shine. I really appreciated that about your work, and I just wanted to add that maybe we don't need to come with a solution. It could be enough just to negate, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, and this just hanging on that, and also in relation to the binaries that I was starting to talk about. Ursula Le Guin, which is like one of my favorite science fiction authors, she wrote the book The Dispossessed, which is about, ultimately, it's about a degrowth world, totally made, like some colony broke out from the Earth to make a degrowth colony on another planet, where there's no word for yours and mine. Everything is shared, and everyone are taking part in making this society. Anyways, and then you have the capitalist world. But what is so interesting and good about her book is that actually none of those worlds are an ideal world. The degrowth world has as many problems as the capitalist world. None of them are perfect. But where the point of realization for the main character of the book, when he actually reach another state of understanding, is actually by traveling between the two worlds. Not in the degrowth world, not in the real world, but traveling between them and using the one to question the other. And I think that is where the potential of fiction lies. To use one reality or one possible future to question another possible future, and being able to operate in that in-between space in order to see possibilities of doing things differently. And that is why capitalism is so afraid of that kind of ambiguous fiction. They want the hero stories, the clear-cut narratives, the tragic hero that, you know, goes down with a ship or whatever, but not these kind of more intricate stories of change. And I think that's where we need to insist on keeping those kind of stories alive, because that is where the potential for real change lies. And just a little thing more about the role of the architect, which I think it's easy to feel very like there's nothing we could do, that everything is just so big around us, like you were saying, Ingrid, like, well, we have to, you know, earn money as a small company, and how can you be idealistic in such a setting? You can be idealistic, you can ask questions from your clients, you can unionize, you can get together. A lot of architects, all architect firms can go together. Big architect firm can support small architect firms in saying no to ridiculous competitions or ridiculous claims by client. We can change something, and we can't sit here and think that we can't. But that is just so important, and we shouldn't forget that.
That's very good. I think that's probably a good moment to have some questions from you. Yeah.
So great I just what I think it's interesting. You started also at the Arkitekturdagen with Jürgen Randers, and one thing he said that if you want to change something, you have to choose the right party, the politic you choose. What I afraid, and while architects probably not really like to get political, we are so busy with other things, with our work. But I think it's time to maybe get political active, because we see it in Oslo with e-flux. So we have to do something. We have to be a part, because we know a lot about people, living, housing, everything. We know the needs. We know what it needs, and so we have to do something about it. It's this tredje boligsektors what is now maybe getting a part of what have to be changed. But I like this changing also in my head, that you have to get involved. It's not going to happen if you don't do. If the architects stay and just draw what they dream of, and then on the other hand, when you get out in the reality, when the utbygger, my English is not so good. Thank you. The developers come and just, yeah, that's what you dream of, but you please draw that. So on one hand, you have to have the economic background to say, oh no, I'm sorry, then I don't work for you. But how many architects have employees which they have to pay and want to keep in bread? So it's really a big challenge to make the good decisions. But like as Snøhetta maybe started already, make studies and check how can we sell actually our good ideas so that the developer is buying them. This is so great. And it's what you said that, yeah, we can do a change, but maybe we have to do it together and finally get up and find new ways where we can stand together and make a difference. So it's so important. It's burning. And yeah, you know. So Jürgen Randers somehow, I think, was saying something about that we have to get involved.
Yeah, I think that's. I was sitting here thinking about politics when you were discussing the role of the architect, because I think it's very interlinked somehow. Any other questions? I have a question. I think your, Cecilia, your metaphor of traveling between these two worlds and using the one world to question the other is pretty fantastic, and maybe somehow some kind of an answer. But then my question is, who does that? Who in society today? Who has that role of traveling between those worlds? Challenge, and I'm not so sure that that's the architect. I don't know if because, or then it's maybe the architect in a different role than within the office somehow.
Well,
but
the architect as a professional, and maybe the architect as a professional architect and the architect as a person. I think we were mentioning a little bit here about being like a person and being a professional. And I think also a problem today is that we hide between a kind of professional mask that kind of limits us from doing something because we need to be professional. And this is, I think, also comes into a feminist perspective or critique here, like the idea of being rational and professional, which kind of locks out emotions or care or this kind of passion for change. And I think exactly that's also traveling between two worlds, to be able to kind of recognize yourself, or as an urban planner, to recognize that people are not just numbers or rational human beings, but knowing from yourself that you make irrational choices sometimes, and that there are other things that you cherish than so and so many square meters, or like the minutiae, which I love the word, is so hard to say, of everyday life, which is something that you, in your everyday, you have so much of, but in your professional life, you're forced to put out. And so using kind of your normal self to question your professional self is also a way of traveling between two worlds and using the one to critique the other, which
But as far as I understand you, one realm should not become an excuse for the other one, like an easy escape, because I think that's a bit too easy, I guess. And there's this classic dilemma in a way that I think was Rousseau who said, well, this is this dilemma between being on the one hand a citoyen who knows exactly what would be good for society, and a bourgeois who wants to make a living.
I would also like just to add one quick comment then, that we all the time fall into the trap of saying the architect, as if the architect was one clear role, one clear persona. There are a million ways of being an architect, and unfortunately only a small spectrum of those possibilities are practiced in architecture schools. You know, we have, and particularly in a school like this, actually but my experience from the AA was different, because all the units had a different way of being an architect. I trained there and I taught there for a few years. But in a lot of schools, the image of what's this to be an architect is very defined and very different to tear yourself away from, and very different. And it's not fair, because it sets you up for disappointment when you come out and you find that it's not like that. And so that's really a job for architecture schools, to promote different roles and different ways of being an architect. What is the architecture about at the end of the day? It's about constructing a space for life, right? And you can do that in so many different ways. And to give a wider range of tools to students that are really to make it possible for you guys to act in the 21st century. That's what architecture schools should be like.
Yeah, totally. And I think this is also where fiction, or what we don't know about architecture, comes into play. Because I guess most architects know, and you also while studying, you know the situation that, okay, you make a project, a design, and then someone, a professor, usually asks you, well, can you explain it? And this is, so you always have to legitimize what you're doing. So in that sense, you could also argue that being an architect also means that you have to construct this role and to produce some kind of a meaning for it. And there's nothing you can take for granted by saying you're an architect. I think this is a historic role and it changes all the time. And maybe we are facing also now these, maybe also hopefully a new time where curricula in schools will be changed. Because I think what we learn in most schools is ages old. And
yeah.
And I think it's a real potential in a way. I think it's great, and maybe it will be greater by some kind of a crisis or so. Who knows?
Thank you. I want to just finish off by saying thank you. Of course, this was an amazing evening. I really appreciated all your input and the discussion, and I think you helped us somehow. You helped the Triennale in the work that we're pursuing, which is about this, which is about questioning the role of architecture in society. It's about questioning the role of the architect and how you practice as an architect, and try to kind of develop discourse on otherwise. And I think you did an amazing job, and I hope we can continue discussing with you in different settings in the future, and hopefully I'm pretty sure we will keep collaborating on e-flux architecture somehow. And thank you for coming, and come back, follow us on what's happening. We'll be quiet for a while, but in the autumn we'll do some more programming, so hope to see you then. Thank you. And a last thing. This is this can be bought. It's this catalog that was the Triennale catalog, which is not the catalog, which is a fictional. It's a series of fictional essays about architecture, gross ideas, tales of tomorrow's architecture. Can be bought online, and can be. Maybe you have one from before. And thank you. And Anna and Luke's. Yeah, exactly. Anna and Luke's essay is a part of it, and they also made the cover of the book. Thank you.